Assalamu alaikum. ये मैं, if I am right, it is week 9 and the first lecture of week 9. The last thing of the last lecture was that Ford became a president by default after the tragedy that happened to Nixon. And the country greeted him to the presidency with a collective sigh of relief. Most observers considered Ford unimaginative, certainly not brilliant, but he was hardworking and, most important, under the circumstances, his record was untouched by any scandal. Ford appeared unlikely to venture beyond conventional boundaries or to act rashly. This was what nearly everyone wanted of the president in the wake of Nixon. It was not, however, what the country most needed. The great issue of the past generation, social welfare, as established by the New Deal and Great Society programs and the Cold War, still seemed central to the national interest, but Ford was unprepared to cope with powerful forces that were already shaking the nation's economic foundations. Unfortunately, Ford displayed inconsistency and apparent incompetence in reacting to economic problem. He identified inflation as the chief economic culprit and asked patriotic citizens to signify their willingness to fight it by wearing whip inflation now buttons. The president was forced to ask for tax cuts and other measures aimed at stimulating business activity. This made inflation worse and did little to promote employment. The economic problems were difficult, and Ford was handicapped by the fact that the Democrats had solid control of Congress, and his performance was at best inept. Ford's record did not inspire confidence. After some hesitation, he nevertheless decided to seek the Republican presidential nomination in 1976, and he was opposed by ex-Governor Ronald Reagan of California, a movie actor turned politician who was the darling of the Republican right wing. But the man who came to be the president was Jimmy Carter, and he shone brightly in comparison with Nixon, and he seemed more forward-looking and imaginative than Ford. He tried to give a tone of democratic simplicity and moral fervor to his administration. After delivering his inaugural address, he walked with his wife, Rosalind, and their small daughter, Amy, in the parade from the Capitol to the White House instead of riding in a limousine. Carter's actual administration of his office did not go nearly so well. He put so many Georgian in important posts that his administration took on a parochial character. The people from Georgia. The administration developed a reputation for submitting complicated proposals to Congress with great fanfare and then failing to follow up on them. Whatever matter Carter was considering at the moment seemed to absorb him totally. Other urgent matters were allowed to drift. But at that point of time, there was a national malaise, a tragedy. The difficulties were symptomatic of a more fundamental flaw in the nation's soul. In a heralded television speech, Carter complained that a moral and a spiritual crisis had sapped people's energies and undermined civic pride. And he said, "We have learned that piling up material goods cannot fill the emptiness of lives which have no confidence or purpose." Please remember this. It's a very strong quote. Critics responded that the nation needed a president rather than a preacher, and their sermons on the emptiness of consumption rang hollow to those who had lost their jobs or watched as inflation shrank their paychecks. 2 years later, simmering discontents among young workers boiled over at the General Motors Assembly Division in Lansdowne, Ohio. GM had installed robotic welding machines, streamlined the workforce and accelerated the assembly line. 100 cars passed through the line each hour, 40 more than under the previous system. Without authorization from the National Union of Automobile Work, many younger workers refused to work at the faster pace, allowing many chases to pass through untouched and throwing the factory into chaos. Union membership slipped badly from the high point of the mid-1950s, when over 1 in 3 non-agriculture workers belonged to unions. By 1978, the natural business cycle and organizers were losing 3/4 of their campaigns to represent workers. Every year, 800 more unions shops voted to resign their affiliation. There's a word, stagflation. It's a combination of this term, is a combination of two words, stagnation and inflation. It was coined to describe this anomaly. In 1971, an inflation rate of 5% had so alarmed President Nixon that he had imposed a price freeze. And by 1975, inflation had soared to 11%, and by 1979, it peaked at a whopping 13%. Unemployment rate from 6 to 10%, nearly twice the usual post-war level. Carter had promised to fight inflation by reducing government spending and balancing the budget, and to stimulate the economy by cutting taxes. But Congress raised the minimum wage to help low-paid workers cope with inflation. So the price spiral seemed unstoppable after this. The federal government made matters worse in several ways, and there were taxpayer revolts as many people turned against long accepted but expensive government programs for aiding the poor. By thus unbalancing the budget, it pumped billions of dollars into the economy, and by borrowing to meet the deficit and pushing up interest rate, it increased the cost of all businesses that had to borrow, and thereby they helped inflation. The 1973 saw that the Vice President of the National Federation of Republican Women and publisher of a conservative newsletter spearheaded a nationwide campaign against ERA, Equal Rights Amendments. This was also first proposed by the National Women's Party in 1923. The National Organization for Women now revived the measures in 1960s. So, the ratification campaign lost momentum and stalled, falling just 3 states short. This Cold War was also one more reason there, and adding to it, there came into being the Iran crisis. In November 1974, 400 armed Muslim militants broke into the American embassy compound in Tehran, Iran, and took everyone within the walls captive. The seizure had roots that ran far back in Iranian history. In 1953, the CIA supported a coup that resulted in the overthrow of Premier Mohammad Mossadegh, presumably intent on nationalizing Iranian petroleum resources. He was replaced by Shah Reza Pahlavi. Although Iran was an enthusiastic member of the OPEC cartel, the Shah was, of obvious reasons, a firm friend of the United States. Iran seemed, as President Carter said in 1977, an island of stability in the troubled Middle East. Throughout 1977, riots and demonstrations convulsed Iran. In 1978, the whole country seemed to rise against the Shah. and finally in January 1979 he was forced to flee. A revolutionary government was headed by a revered religious leader, the Ayatollah Khomeini, and he assumed power. Khomeini denounced United States of America and he called it as a great Satan, whose support of the Shah, he said, had caused the Iranian people untold suffering. And when President Carter allowed the Shah to come to the States for medical treatment for cancer, the seizure of the Tehran embassy resulted. And as months passed by, a stalemate developed between Iran and USA. The crisis produced a remarkable emotional response in the United States. And because of this embassy hostages, nevertheless, the hostages languished in Iran. In 1980, in April, Carter finally ordered a team of Marine commandos flown into Iran in Sea Stallion helicopters in a desperate attempt to free the hostages. The raid was a fiasco. Several helicopters broke down while the others were gathered at a desert rendezvous south of Tehran. Carter called off the attempt. In the confusion of a night departure, there was a crash and 8 commandos were killed. The stalemate continued, and when the Shah died in July 1980, it made no difference to the Iranians. And so, despite the failure of the raid and persistence of stagflation, Carter won the Democratic nomination on the first ballot. And his Republican opponent in the campaign that followed was Ronald Reagan, the former governor of California, who had almost defeated Gerald Ford for the nomination in 1976. And in our next lecture, we'll talk about Ronald Reagan.